I'm going to say something to you that probably many of you agree with. Many of you may not know everything about what I'm going to say, but this statement is, tobacco is a thoroughly disgusting plant. God made it for a reason, which I have yet to figure out. Tobacco is the common name of several plants in the Nicotiana family, or genus actually, Nicotiana, named for the stimulant alkaloid nicotine, to which tobacco users become addicted. I don't know if you're aware of this, but tobacco is part of the nightshade family, and many of those plants of the nightshade family are poisonous to human beings. Most also are not aware that the drug nicotine is more addictive than cannabis, caffeine, alcohol, cocaine, and heroin. Now, the reason why it is more addictive than those is because nicotine is both a strong and persistent bodily and mental and emotional need, or it forms a strong and persistent bodily and mental emotional need. So it's not just that your body craves it, it's also that your mind craves it. And so it makes it very addictive. Dried and cured tobacco leaves are consumed in cigarettes and cigars, pipes and hookahs, but it also can be consumed as snuff and chewing and dipping tobaccos. Over the last several decades, where we've had the medical, technical ability to figure things out like this, we've learned about the carcinogenic properties in smoking tobacco products. Tobacco is known to be a cause of lip, tongue, throat, lung, blood, stomach, kidney, pancreas, colon, bladder, and cervical cancers. It has also been linked to such things as stroke, dementia, Parkinson's disease, blindness, heart disease, hardening of the arteries, asthma, reduced fertility and miscarriages, and various infections and bone density problems, among others. I didn't even list them all. 10% of fire deaths in the world are attributed to smoking. And a similar small percentage of deaths around the world are attributed to smoking while driving, that is, motor vehicle deaths. Somewhere in the range of 5 to 10% of those are distracted driving because somebody is lighting a cigarette or has ash put on their lap or something that distracts them, they have an accident and kill somebody. Snuff and chewing tobaccos are also deadly in their own ways. I don't have the time to get into all of that. Now, some tobacco species, like Nicotiana glauca, are invasive weeds. They're like kudzu, and they destroy all kinds of arable lands if they're allowed to come in. But all tobacco varieties destroy the soil on which they are grown. And this is one of the things that makes it such a thoroughly disgusting plant. In the 1700s, tobacco was the chief crop in many of the mid-Atlantic and southern states of the colonies at the time, especially in Virginia and North Carolina. And both of those states actually still grow a great deal of tobacco. Growers of tobacco in the mid-1700s could make a killing by growing, harvesting, and curing it on as large a scale a basis as they could. But there were three major problems that they had to overcome. The first is that tobacco products or tobacco crops need a lot of land. They're not small plants. And so to get the amount of leaves you need for a commercial enterprise, you need a lot of land. The second is that farming it at the time, especially before some of the innovations, was very labor intensive. So it needed a lot of hands to get it to harvest, not just in plowing and planting, but they had to have laborers pretty much in the fields all the time to take the bugs off of the plants, because they would eat the leaves, and the leaves were where your cash was. So they had to have people going up and down the rows, killing the bugs that were on them. They didn't have a whole lot of pesticides at the time. The third problem was that tobacco extracts more than its share of nutrients from the soil, particularly phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium. Those are pretty much the big three of what is needed in the soil. And even today, tobacco farms are heavy users of both chemical fertilizers and pesticides, because those problems have only been overcome slightly. Well, undeterred, even though they had to face these problems, tobacco farmers, ones like our illustrious first and third presidents, Washington and Jefferson, allotted large acreages of their plantations to tobacco. And they procured indentured servants from England, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, many other places, and later they imported slaves to work the fields. So they purchased, cut, and burned, actually, thousands of acres, and it kept going westward in Virginia and westward in North Carolina, because they needed new lands for this. So they would look at and buy forested lands as you approached the mountains in the east, or in the west of these states, and then they would cut the trees down, burn them, and plant tobacco on them. As much tobacco as they could fit on these acreages. And you can be sure that they did not keep any of the land Sabbaths once they got tobacco on these pieces of land. Now, their first couple of years were usually bumper crops. The soil was virgin. It had all the nutrients that had built up in the soil for hundreds or even thousands of years. So it was nutrient rich. But each year, after the first 2 or 3, each year after that, they noticed that they began to receive diminishing returns. And after just a few years of that, their crops could no longer cover their costs, because they were putting a lot of money into these ventures, not only buying seed, but the pay and all of the travel that had to be done. Because remember, their main plantations were in one part of Virginia, and their tobacco fields were far to the west. There was a lot of travel costs for them and for their employees, and then shipping it down to the port was not easy or inexpensive either. So many of these plantation owners went into debt to buy new land on the frontier and restart the process. The ruined wasteland that their tobacco crops left behind was useless now for farming anything, much less food crops. And so those great swaths of acreage were left fallow for decades. And in many cases, the forests reclaimed them over time, and only then did they get their Sabbaths. George Washington, we owe him a lot, and there are certain things we don't know that we owe him, and this is one of them. See, George Washington was smarter in agricultural matters than Thomas Jefferson. By the way, Thomas Jefferson was one of those who went deeply into debt because of this tobacco process. Washington, though, in about early 1760s, began to see this cycle play out. that he would open up 100, 200, 300 acres of land and only get about 7 good years out of it. And actually the last 4 or so were red, but it was only held up by the first couple or 3, which were in the black. So he concluded, after watching this a few times, he concluded that tobacco farming was not sustainable. He didn't quite use that word. That's a word we use quite a bit now environmentally, but that's in essence what he concluded. Tobacco farming was not sustainable. So in 1767, he quit the practice altogether. He no longer was a tobacco farmer. An article on farm structure from the mountvernon.org website records what he did next. And I'll quote this. Excuse me. Quote, Washington transitioned to grains and food crops rather than continuing as a planter locked into a single staple, like tobacco. The shift to farming allowed Washington to introduce more innovative practices such as crop rotation and intensive plowing. By the time he left to take command of the Continental Army in 1775, Mount Vernon was a thriving agricultural enterprise, though Washington's 8-year absence during the war interrupted its progress. It was after the Revolutionary War that George Washington began his correspondence with several leading English agronomists. From them, he imported not only ideas, but also skilled workers, new crops, and equipment. Not satisfied with the 3-year crop rotation he had been using, Washington designed complex 6- and 7-year systems. He also experimented tirelessly with various fertilizers and crops. By the end of his life, his enslaved workers had raised or tested nearly 60 different crops. Unquote. What we see here is that Washington not only was a good general and a good president, but he also figured out a better way of farming in the Americas. The old Virginia way of farming, focused on tobacco, had its benefits, but ultimately it ended in failure, waste, and ruin, both financial and environmental. Most, like Thomas Jefferson, our third president, had to find out the hard way that their traditional ways would not succeed in achieving their goals. And Washington's better methods slowly supplanted that older, greedier, more destructive way, even past the end of his life. Now, that's an illustration. That's my introduction. What Jesus does in his Sermon on the Mount is similar to what George Washington did in improving the agronomy practices in the colonies and later in the states. Jesus announces a better way. Just like George Washington did all of his experiments and came up with a better way. Jesus' announcement was far better, far greater than what George Washington did, but the process was similar. The Jews had amassed centuries of traditional understanding, and it simply did not work to produce true godly righteousness. They had all those hundreds of years of experience to see, for all the way from God's giving of the law on Mount Sinai, all the way to Jesus' time, about 1,450 years, we think. They could see that over that time, it had not produced the righteousness God was looking for. It had produced a righteousness. Jesus describes it in Matthew 5 as the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. But he says that his disciples' righteousness has to be greater than, better than the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. So Christ informs them here in the Sermon on the Mount that God's way, followed as he intended from the very beginning, produces better fruit and a more abundant crop. See what I did there? Brought it back around to agriculture. Now this sermon is part 2 in my series, But I Say to You, and it's taken from, the title that is taken from Jesus' use, I think it's 6 times in this chapter, from verse 21 on. He tells them, but I say unto you, or I say to you. Let's go to Matthew 5 and get a running start into this, because I started speaking about what Jesus was doing when I gave my last sermon, when I was out in Phoenix. So I just want to touch on this again so that we flow into verse 21 through 26 better. Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you, that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, just as a summary of what we went over last time. Here in this paragraph, Jesus confirms that his way, his teaching, does not nullify the law, not by any means. As a matter of fact, he says here very positively that the law will remain until all is fulfilled. And as I said, I think that what Jesus meant there was all of God's purposes, everything that God is doing. So there won't be a need to do away with the law until everything is finished. You'll probably remember that I said that the law is one of his most useful tools that he uses to bring his people to righteousness, guiding them to godliness and holiness, and he does not throw away a useful tool. Any craftsman would be foolish to throw away a tool that he needs in his toolbox or on his tool belt to finish the job. And the law is one of those tools that God uses all the time. Remember Austin's 75-cent screwdriver? Well, the law, worth a lot more than 75 cents, but it is God's go-to tool to help us to understand what right and wrong is. And we'll see later on it's useful in other ways as well. But the law is a vital part of his kingdom. Remember, that's one of the definitions of a kingdom, that a kingdom not only needs a king, it needs area, and all those, but it needs a law. It needs some sort of standards by which it can govern. And so the law is one of those things that is useful in multiple ways. And so he's not going to nullify it or do away with it by any means. It's far too valuable. And then he goes on and says that only those who grow beyond the Pharisees' legalistic righteousness will enter his kingdom. And that is exactly what the Pharisees taught, a legalistic righteousness, a legalistic way of looking at things. There was the law, and there was the law. And there was only one way to interpret the law, which was at its letter. There was, or on its letter, by its letter would be better. But that's the only way to look at it. They did not go beyond the bounds at all of what the very literal interpretation of the law was, which is actually the reason I'm giving this sermon, because that's what Jesus opened up, something beyond that very legalistic look at the law. They taught and observed a very rigid system. letter of the law, as I said, their approach was based only on what was written, and later on, they added their traditional understanding of the sages, and it was all put into their oral law, and it was passed down from generation to generation. But Jesus is here telling us, getting the first inklings of it in verse 20, that that's not enough. That's only baby babble in terms of what the law actually contains. There is a lot more to the law than just simply what is written. It stands for a whole lot. I mean, we talk about God only has 10 laws. That's true in its own sense. Those were the ones they put their focus on, the Jews that is. But he has a whole book here of instruction as commentary on those 10 laws. There's a lot more in there, plus all the spiritual application that can come from rightly dividing the word of truth that we can get out of the law. And it opens the law's scope so far that it reaches into our very innards and strangles us, actually. The law is not benign in many ways because it shows us what wrong is. And the curse of the law, of course, is death. And so we have to, as Christ's disciples, look much more broadly at the law than the Jews, the Pharisees, and the scribes, and all those people back then ever did. So God's people not only followed the letter, that's still there. That's definitely there. But also the law's spiritual intent. And the spiritual intent involves inner attitudes and foundational spiritual principles. Those are the things that the Pharisees left out. Now, the rest of Matthew 5, from verse 21 all the way through verse 48, so that's the whole remainder of the chapter, consists of 6 major examples. What we saw here in verses 17 through 20 was a preamble. It was an introduction. Jesus is just warming up to his subject when we get to verse 21. Because here in verse 21, all the way through verse 48, he gives us examples of what he means by our righteousness exceeding that of the scribes and the Pharisees. What kind of thinking do we need to have to go beyond the strict legalistic letter of the law approach that the scribes and the Pharisees had? And so the easiest way to teach people is by giving them examples. And so that's what he does. He gives us 6 illustrations of how to apply right spiritual thinking guided by the Holy Spirit in various scenarios, situations that might come up throughout our lives. So here we have then 6 ways that we can learn to approach a question of law and what it covers, what it entails. So Jesus uses the examples of murder, adultery, divorce, making oaths, revenge, and loving one's neighbor. Hits a big one right at the end and leaves everybody with their tongues hanging out of their mouth. And he does this, he uses these 6 examples to point out how limited and even harmful the letter of the law approach is compared to the spirit. If the spirit of the law approach is not by any means harmful or limited, it's actually very expansive, and it also produces growth. spiritual growth particularly. So, in these six examples, in nearly every case, there's one or two that don't follow this, but in every case, Jesus explains that the spiritual approach requires more sacrifice, more understanding, more compassion, more commitment, higher standards, and a broader and long-term approach to life and goodness than the letter of the law approach. Everything is elevated. Everything is more spiritual. Everything requires more from us. Now, we can see this in his summary statement that he gives after the 6 examples are finished. Let's look in verse 48. This tells you the height of the standard that he is trying to get across. Therefore, you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's what he's aiming for. Talk about high standards. He's saying, if you want to get to the goal, perfect, holy, righteous character of the Father, this is how you do it. You learn from these examples how to divide the scriptures and pull out the spirit of the law and what you're supposed to do in every situation. He covers, this is what he felt was necessary. So this is the whole gamut of ways of looking at things differently than the ways of the scribes and the Pharisees, and more like what he did when he was approaching and making a judgment on a certain point of law, or even an aspect of life. And so he gives us in these 6 examples enough for us to go on, perhaps not to become perfect, that'll only happen in the resurrection, but at least be oriented and moving in that direction by the time our time is over in this life. So the goal, as it says here in verse 48, is perfection. Like I said, the perfect, holy, righteous character of God himself. The word perfect here, as you may know in your studies, is teleos. That's Strong's 5046, 5046. And this word, in other places it is translated complete or full grown or mature, but right here, the translation of perfect is perfect. It's absolutely necessary here because you cannot describe God anything less than perfect. And Jesus is saying here that our goal is to be perfect like he is. So, since God himself is perfection, we can say then that his perfect nature is our standard and our goal. Now, Jesus' 6 examples that he gives here all follow a common format. It starts with, you have heard X, and X is a statement of law. And then he says, it is followed by, but I say to you, why? Not why the question, why as a letter here. Why is an explanation of God's intent. So you start with the law, and then Jesus says, but I say to you, this is God's intent. And then he gives an illustration or 2. That's how each one of these 6 examples go. So he gives us a starting point by telling us, you have heard this. And then he says, but I'm telling you that this other thing is better. And then he says, I'll give you some examples so you know how to apply this. That's the formula here. He uses it pretty much that way throughout. Now, this X statement that I talked about, the one that is a statement of law, the first thing that he says in each one of these examples, what he says there in that statement is what first century Jews commonly believed and what the Pharisees and the scribes taught their disciples and preached in the synagogues. It was what we might call common religious knowledge of the time. It's pretty much what every Jew believed, because that is what they've been taught from the time they were little. Much or many of these statements that he made to start out these 6 examples is straight from the Torah. It's actually quotations from the Pentateuch or some other part of the Old Testament. So it was part of God's instruction in the book. And people recognized that. Oh yeah, that's one of the commandments, obviously, like this first one. You shall not murder. Commandment number 6, that came directly out of the Torah. And everybody would nod sagely and stroke their beards and say, yes, yes, that's true. So Jesus would hit them with something that everybody knew. You know, it was like, you know, some teenager saying, no duh, Jesus. Everybody knows that. Now, on top of that, after that, and a couple of these, he also gives perhaps some commentary from the sages. Now, we don't have quotation marks on these because they don't come out of the Bible, but they are commonly thought expressions or something that the sages would have said after saying the obvious thing, the quotation from Torah. So here in verse 21, it says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. That's our quotation from the law, from Torah. And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. Many commentators believe that that second statement is what would follow in the preaching of you shall not murder. That it was commonly expressed that if a murderer was found out, he would be in danger of the judgment. Obviously, there are things in the Old Testament that expand on what is said there in Exodus 20. Verse 13? The commandment against murder. And so you have various judgments about whether if a murder or a killing was accidental or not, or all the commentary about going to a city of refuge and what could happen there, and all those different things that apply. But the summary statement of all of those things, including the punishment of a murderer, would be included in this summary statement: whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. So Jesus gives here 2 elements, not just the law as spoken from Sinai, but he also gives a summary that the Pharisees would have used about that law. Both are true. As a matter of fact, this summary is kind of like another no duh. If there's a murderer, there's going to be, that person has come under judgment, whether they catch him or not. A murderer needs to be found and brought to punishment, made to pay. So, what I'm trying to get at here, in my long roundabout way, is that these are statements that everybody would have agreed on. Every Jew that would have been maybe standing there listening to Jesus would agree both with the quotation from the commandments and with the summary of what happens to such a person, or what should happen to such a person. Something like this, excuse me, also comes up in verse 43. where it says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. We'll get to that one in whenever we get to this particular one. But this one's a little bit different because God never tells us to hate our enemy. But this was a conclusion, if you will, that if you're supposed to love your neighbor, you could hate your enemy. Okay, we'll get to that later. Not today. Who knows when. But that's generally what is happening here in these 6 examples. Okay, the second part of that is, he says, but I say to you. And this is radical. Entirely radical. Because Jesus has just told them something. They all nodded and said, yeah, that's right. If you preach it, Jesus, that sort of thing. But he comes right forward at that point and says, but no, I say, why? He says something different. He contradicts the common knowledge. And a religious Jew of the time would immediately think, once he said, but I say to you, he would immediately think, he's changing the law. He's putting himself and his teaching above Torah, above the sages, above tradition. You could just see Tevye condemning him for not following the Torah on this. Many of them would say, thinking about it for a few seconds, would say, he's claiming to be greater than God. Or he's claiming to be God. Because he's contradicting the law given by God. And you know what? That's exactly what he was doing. He was not contradicting the law. That was their perspective. But he was returning it to its original intent by his own authority. How could he do that? Because he was the same one who gave it from Mount Sinai. He was the same creator God, the lawgiver, that had thundered these words from Mount Sinai, and only he and the Father had the right and the authority to say anything different. And so anybody who was spiritually in tune would recognize that that's exactly what he was doing. That he was claiming the authority and prerogatives of God to make a change, even in a positive sense, in the law. He's putting himself right in front of the line of those who had the ability to make a statement about the law that they had never heard before, which made him God. So he's using, here in the Sermon on the Mount, he's using his divine authority to set the record straight and teach his disciples the correct orientation toward the law at the same time. So he sets the record straight publicly, and then he also teaches his disciples how they should approach the law. Now, by the way, remember this is being said in the Sermon on the Mount. The chapter starts with him going up into a mountain, gathering his disciples around him, and he sits down and opens his mouth and says. So he becomes the teacher of his disciples. He's sitting there in a position of authority, and he's teaching them, his disciples. This is not the Sermon on the Plain as Luke, in Luke 6, records. And what do you know? these 6 examples, as a matter of fact, this whole thing about the law is absent from Luke 6. Because he wasn't teaching this to the people at large. He wasn't teaching this to the multitudes. This was going directly to his disciples. Can you imagine if he had said this publicly? How many times do we see in the Gospels where it says, and they took up stones to stone him? Well, that would have happened if he had said this in the Sermon on the Plain. The people, I should say, he would have put himself and his disciples in danger of their lives if he had said this publicly. But he said it to his disciples. And think about it, frankly, only his disciples with access to the Holy Spirit can understand actually what he's saying and put them into practice. It would have just fallen on deaf ears to the multitudes if they had not rioted or somehow tried to kill Jesus for what he said. Okay, let's get into this paragraph, Matthew 5, verses 21 and 22. I want to read these to get started here. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire or Gehenna fire. Now, we'll get the rest of this in a bit. But Jesus here recites the 6th commandment from Exodus 20, verse 13. Excuse me. And he follows it with the conventional logical conclusion, as I mentioned before, that a person who is a murderer should be judged for it. No society can let murderers run free. I don't know that there is any society in the world where murderers are allowed to run free. Maybe when there's anarchy going on in a society, when there's no law around, will murderers be able to get away with it so much? But as soon as law and order come back, they round up the murderers and judge them. That's just how functioning society works. It's one of the major laws that every society has to have. So those who kill their fellow human beings, when apprehended, will be tried, judged, and punished. That's what this extra statement means. And by putting it this way, you shall not murder, and those who murder will be in danger of the judgment. By putting it this way, Jesus is intimating that this common understanding is the whole law against murder in most people's minds. That's the extent of what they think about murder in terms of law. That murder is bad and that murderers should be judged. That is a very simple way of putting it, but it's essentially what most people think, what they believe. And they normally, unless they're in some sort of law enforcement or judicial job, they don't think much more about it than this. Or unless they've been affected by murder themselves one way or the other. In this way, we can look at it as one, the common way of thinking about murder, and two, a slight put down by Jesus that this is all that most people think about in terms of this law. That generally people don't think it through is one thing that we can pull from this by reading between the lines. Because frankly, what he is doing here is pointing out people's shallowness on these subjects, particularly the Jews. He's saying, look, guys, you've had 1,400 or so years to come up with good explanations, deep explanations of this particular law and how to not only to enforce it and judge it, but also to avoid it. And what have you come up with? Something that I can summarize in a few words. But don't you think that it's a lot more complex than just this? I mean, this is a serious, really life and death subject. And all you have is the original, very brief law, and murderers should be judged. I mean, that's very shallow. Now, Jesus, the God of the Old Testament, the author of the Ten Commandments, can never be accused of being a shallow thinker. I mean, really, did the Israelites, and later the Jews, think that all God thought about the subject of murder was, you shall not murder? I mean, really, what did they think of their God? That he had the mind of a 6-year-old? We teach our kids the Ten Commandments. And by the time they're in their early elementary school years, they know what murder is. When you teach them the Ten Commandments and they recite the sixth one, they know they're not supposed to kill another person. And that's about as far as the Jews, who were supposed to be caretakers and teachers of the law, had taken it. Jesus is saying, you guys are still thinking like little children. And so he has to contradict them. He has to correct their shallowness. But I say to you, he could have been pounding on their heads. Think, think, think. Where does murder come from? Why do people murder? All you guys think about is when the knife comes out of the body, or the bullet goes through the brain, or whatever it is. You didn't think that something else was happening before the blow was struck? And all you do is take care of the aftermath by catching the guy and bringing him before the judge? He's teaching his disciples, not just the apostles, you and me, that we have to think more deeply. And particularly we have to think about causes, sources, beginnings, reasons, motivations, and all of those things, attitudes that come before an actual physical act that breaks the letter. Don't be dumb bunnies like the Jews of the time were. Be wise as serpents. Understand everything about this. If we don't have the background of understanding the full gamut of this law against murder, we can't judge. Not righteously. We don't understand. We don't have the mind of Christ on this. Because there's a lot more going on under the umbrella of the sixth commandment than meets the eye. It takes a lot of thought. So, Jesus has to contradict this. this very general and childish way of looking at the commandment. So he severely undercuts this common belief by what he says. He says, "But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause," actually that "without a cause" is probably not in the original. It seems to have been put in several centuries later to make what Jesus said less caustic. So let's read that again. "Whoever is angry with his brother shall be in danger of the judgment. Whoever says to his brother, Rakah, shall be in danger of the council." Rakah means like something like you idiot, you knucklehead. And whoever says you fool, that's moron, that sort of thing, to his brother shall be in danger of hellfire. And by the way, all of these punishments are the same. It's not increasing in severity or anything. They all mean that if you're angry with your brother, you face the death penalty. If you call your brother a knucklehead, you face the death penalty. If you call your brother a fool or a moron or an idiot, you face the death penalty. That's what he's saying. Because what is the wages of sin? Doesn't matter what the sin is. The wages of sin is death. So whether it's just calling your brother a fool is just as bad in this way, in terms of ultimate punishment, as bad as being angry with him or killing him outright. So the Jews thought murder began with the violent act of taking another's life, but Jesus says, hold on, you've totally ignored the greater part of the process of murder. It begins with anger, it begins with contempt, it begins with condemnation, it begins with belittling your brother, it begins with undervaluing the other person, making them less than you. Murder begins inside, in the head, in the heart, in the mind, with wrong attitudes, unchecked negative emotions, pride, and poor judgment. Let's go to Mark, the 7th chapter, Mark 7, and read verses 17 through 23. Mark 7, 17 through 23. This is where he had told the Jews that it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles, but what comes out of the mouth. Okay. Here again, notice how this is introduced. He's teaching his disciples privately. And when he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, "Are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, purifying all foods," meaning purging them, taking all the defilement out, as it were, through the eliminative system. And he said, "What comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, an evil eye, looking at another person in an odd way, like you have some sort of sorcery, blasphemy, pride, foolishness." I mean, he covers a lot of territory with all these. All of them come from inside. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. So he says here, just using the example of murder, murder doesn't come out of nowhere. It just doesn't suddenly come into a person's mind and they stab, the person sitting next to them on the bus. It doesn't happen that way. It starts long before and inside of that person. Its source is the heart, the mind, the attitudes, the emotions, that interior, immaterial, spiritual core that makes us a human. Jesus says that core, what we call human nature, is defiled and produces selfish, defiling, violent, evil acts. Every one of those acts comes from inside. There is nothing that comes from outside that defiles the man. It's what he does and comes out of him that defiles him. Another person, in other words, cannot make us sin. We do it ourselves. It's from what comes from inside us. So all the judgment in the world after the fact of the murder, let's say, as Jesus was talking about that in chapter 5, verse 21, all the judgment in the world after the fact will never produce righteousness. It's too late. The act has been done. What can you do? Because under God's judgment, once the act is done, the person is guilty of death. And so he comes under the curse. So, if that sentence is carried out, the person dies, that just cuts the sinner off from any further evil acts. It also cuts him off from any kind of repentance. So the Jews' solution to murder did nothing to change the character of the person, to keep him from doing more evil acts. All it did was punish the infraction. It did not change the heart. Now, maybe for some people looking on, it perhaps could change their hearts, but the person who is actually guilty of the murder is done. It's finished. There's no change possible if you apply what the Jews did. Person's guilty of murder, he comes under judgment. There's no learning from it. There's no growth. It's a done deed. All done. There's no hope. But Jesus brings a better way, a way in which there is hope. The way the law should be used, the way it should be thought about, not as a way of punishment and cutting somebody off from life, from change. But Jesus wants us to use the law, as a way to bring redemption, change, repentance, and righteousness. That's what the law does. Looking at it in a positive sense. We all look at it so negatively that it brings a curse and we're going to die. But if we use it in the right way to keep us from doing any of these things, then it becomes a force for good. So that we do not do those things and we work backwards from that toward purifying the core. Jesus says, you Jews never thought of it this way. It was just a sword to you to get rid of evildoers. It was not in any way a tool for improvement. So, the only true solution to murder or any other sinful behavior, now notice how I put that, the only true solution to murder or any other sinful behavior is changing the human core in each individual. That's the only way that there is going to be righteousness produced. It has to be in each individual's inside, in the mind, in the heart. The defilement that Jesus talks about there in Mark 7 must be purged. It must be cleansed. It must be repented of through metanoia. Remember, I made a big deal of that a while back. Metanoia, the changing or transforming of the mind. Romans 12, 1 through 2. We have to make sacrifices. We have to become a human sacrifice so that we don't conform to the world, but we are transformed in our minds so that we can understand what God really wants us to do, wants us to be. It's what Paul calls putting off the old man and putting on the new. That's what Jesus is just beginning to explain in these examples. Paul made a big deal of it, but the origin of that idea is right here in the book of Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount. It's a fundamental teaching of Jesus Christ. We need to change from the heart out. So, every year, what is the first thing we do? We keep the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. And what's the theme of the days of unleavened bread? Putting out sin and putting in righteousness. Living an unleavened life. Paul said in 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 5, that it's purging the old leaven and becoming a new loaf, a new lump of bread. It's what we call sanctification. Becoming holy. Putting on the righteousness of God. Transforming into the character of Jesus Christ. That's what he begins with in the Sermon on the Mount. Hey, guys, let's start working on our attitudes. So I've got 8 of them here for you. Blessed are the poor in spirit, etc., etc., etc. Then he says, you're the salt of the earth. Don't lose what you've been given. Because if you lose what you've been given, well, the only thing after that is to be trampled. You don't want that. So be a light of the world. Be a light in the house. Be a witness of God's way. And don't think that the law is unnecessary. Oh no, it's not. It's here to stay. It's a vital tool. But understand, you know those Pharisees, they're really big on the law. Well, you've got to be more righteous than them. And here's how you do it. I've got 6 examples. This is how we purge out the leaven and we become unleavened and be those witnesses, the light to the world that God wants us to be. So, in this first example, back in Matthew 5, his first example of the spiritual intent of the law, Jesus is intent on showing that the law's function is more than just what Paul says in Romans 3:20 and 7:7, that it gives us the knowledge of sin. He says, I would not have known what covetousness was except that the law told me. It gives us the knowledge of sin. It's a standard of right and wrong. But Jesus is saying that view, perfectly good, perfectly true, is limited. Because the law is, to Jesus, both gauge and guide. Yes, it tells us what the law is, but it also guides us into righteousness. It's a help. Why do you think The psalmist wrote all those verses on the law in Psalm 119. Look at the law from that perspective. You could see that it's so much broader than the Big Ten. The Big Ten are just summaries of all the other parts of the law, all the other parts of the instruction. That's what Torah means. All the parts of the instruction that God has given us in His Word. So it not only tells us what sin is, but it also leads us to find causes and sources so that we can root out all that defiles us. And what remains in us after a lifetime of such rooting out, after a lifetime of what we in this age call self-improvement, after a lifetime of sanctification, what's left is the righteous character of Jesus Christ. Let's go back to Matthew 5 and just quickly look at these examples that Jesus gave. Matthew 5, verses 22 through 26. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar, and go your way. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift to God. Agree with your adversary quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge. The judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, when he says that, underline it because he's making something very clear, very strong. He's saying a very strong point. You will by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny. Very strong words. Now, like I said, we don't need to go into the technicalities of the words there in verse 22. As I mentioned before, the gist here is that murder, anger, contempt, offense, and mean-spirited ridicule are equally condemnable. They all fall under the larger umbrella of the law against murder, the sixth commandment. They are all evils. Now, sometimes we think, oh, ridicule, that's not evil. Or, like I mentioned before, undervaluing somebody, that's not evil. That's kind of petty, maybe, but not evil. Well, talk to Jesus Christ about that. Because that's what he said. Each one of them puts a person under judgment if we do them. Now remember, he that is our judge sees the heart. There's more behind ridicule and undervaluing somebody, than just that. There is a whole history usually of feelings and attitudes and sins and other things that makes a person ridicule another or undervalue them. So we have to understand that the judge knows what is in men. It says that very clearly in John 2, verse 25, that Jesus knows what is in human beings. He's our judge. And he says that the spirit of murder is found in each of these things. Yes, actual murder, but also anger, contempt, offense, mean-spirited ridicule, and so forth. The spirit or the underlying attitudes that come out in murder are also present in these other things that we think are not so bad. But they are bad because they can lead ultimately to murder. And we've got to nip it in the bud, as it were, Otherwise, it may just come out as murder. Beth mentioned one on the way here. Something that happens all the time on the internet, and we call it murder. Although we don't think of it as murder. Character assassination. That's murder. Right in the term. What do assassins do? Slap them lightly on the cheek? No, assassins kill. That's their job. Character assassination is murder. Even though the person is not physically killed, his character is. What about doxing? What about cancellation? They are all forms of murder under the spirit of the law. Maybe you didn't think about that. But we live in a society guided by the one who was a murderer from the beginning, and his attitudes infiltrate into every part of life and even into the church. Be careful what you say on social media. If you're character assassinating, you're murdering, and you have come under judgment. Just think about it. So he advises here in verse 23, rather than exist in a state of murderous contempt and disunity, solve the problem. Don't want to have this spirit of murder like a dark cloud over a relationship with anyone. So if you know that your brother has evil thoughts against you, you're involved in this whether you like it or not, because you're the object of the offense, right? If there, remember that your brother has something against you. It's his problem, but you're involved. God says, Jesus says, our God says, before you worship God, before you serve God, before you give him some sort of a gift of yourself, solve the problem. Reconcile with your brother, even though the problem is with him. Don't let that linger in your relationship. Because why? He doesn't say it here, but it's affecting your relationship with God. Clean up your physical relationship and then come back and be pure and wholesome and holy before God, having cleansed that sin. Even if it's not your sin. Do you see the extent of Jesus' thinking about this? And how responsible we are. Now, I put my 50 cents out there in saying that the reason why the brother is offended is because of something we have done. And it might not even be something that we have done purposely, but we have somehow caused the offense, and the brother has something against us. That's why we're involved. But he says, you remember that your brother has something against you. It comes to mind that, oh yeah, I shouldn't have done that. He probably hates me. Well, first take care of that relationship problem. Make sure you restore a relationship of love between the two of you before you come back before God. Because it's important. These relationships are linked. The relationship we have with a brother and the relationship we have with God are one. Because he's the third party in both of our relationships. He's mostly talking about within the church. He's talking to his disciples. The disciples' brothers were their fellow disciples. So he's starting here in his family, and he's saying, Better be careful, that spirit of murder, because it's going to affect your relationship with God if you have, or your brother has, any of these murderous thoughts or murderous attitudes toward you or you toward them. Work it out. This should not exist in the church. If you're really with it, clean up your relationships. If you really want to be in God's kingdom, reconcile with your brother. The second illustration or example here that Jesus gives is more general advice about preventing disputes that cause ill will and relationship problems. Agree with your adversary quickly presupposes that in this life, human beings will disagree about things. We'll have different perspective about things. We'll think we have done something, and the other person says, "Nah, you still owe me," whatever. There are things that we just don't get along on simply because we're human and we're selfish and we make mistakes and many other factors besides. So we will have situations, circumstances where we disagree with one another. It's bound to happen. But it's up to the Christian to ensure that, one, he's not disagreeable, that he's willing to work on something, that he is not the problem, and that he will do his best to work out a solution. So the responsibility comes upon the Christian, if in any dispute, to make sure that it does not escalate any further, that it's solved as immediately as possible. So he charges us here to make sure no disagreements escalate into major crises, especially if they go to the point, or they could go to the point, in which the authorities are called in to adjudicate the matter. He says, avoid that at all costs. Pay the debt. Do whatever you have to do to solve the problem, to appease the other person, if you will. So, to avoid these kind of disputes, he says, the Christian, the one who is thinking most like Jesus Christ, must be the one to sacrifice, to give in, to take the loss, because it is the lesser of the outcomes. It would be far better to take a loss, to give in, to lose face, whatever it is, than to destroy a relationship and all the other negative outcomes that would come out of that. I mean, look what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6. 1 Corinthians 6. Right in verse 1. Dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Why didn't you handle this internally? Why take it out into the people who don't know any better? More than just, if you're a murderer, you're going to come under judgment. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? Don't you know you need to be developing your ability to judge these matters? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Verse 4. If then you have judgments concerning things pertaining to this life, do you appoint those who are least esteemed by the church to judge? I say this to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you, not even one who will be able to judge between his brethren? If you have a dispute with someone who is a brother, take it to somebody wise and in the church and make reconciliation. That's what Paul is saying here. But, he's saying this to the Corinthians' shame, brother goes to law against brothers, and that before unbelievers. Now, therefore, it is already an utter failure for you that you go to law against one another. He's saying you've already taken this the wrong direction and too far. It's already a sin to you. Why do you not rather accept wrong? Why do you not rather let yourselves be defrauded? That's the Christian way, to give in and stop the argument. Stop the terrible relationship right there and reconcile. No, you yourselves do wrong and defraud, and you do these things to your brethren. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Paul is pretty tough. If you've gotten to the point where you can't reconcile with your brother, it's a shame. You've already failed, he said. So it becomes first priority that you reconcile. So, in this first example that we've seen in Matthew 5, verses 21 through 26, Jesus hits Pharisaical righteousness between the eyes. The law is a matter of the heart, the mind, the attitudes and emotions. They all must be governed by the righteousness of God, which is defined in his Torah, his instruction, his law. It is not enough just to avoid the physical act of murder. Jesus' disciples must root out even the smallest inclination toward hating and harming another individual. But as we'll see in later examples, they have to go even farther and love even their worst enemies, because that's the standard we've been called to. I hope you all have a wonderful Sabbath.